Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our world first of an online Autistic Pride event. Thank you so much to the organisers for making this happen, and to Joseph for holding this slot for London Autistic Pride. I know that this has taken a lot of work, and I really appreciate the effort that everyone has put in. So my name is Sarah McCulloch, and I'm the founder of the Autistic Empire, which is an autistic social organisation built by and for autistic adults to form community based on autism as a civic identity and to produce tools and services for autistic people. Now, what is it that we mean by autism as a civic identity? As it stands, the keys of the kingdom of autism are currently held by psychiatrists. They define what it means to be autistic, who gets to be autistic and who doesn't, what is a legitimate autistic trait or experience and what isn't. They base the gatekeeping not on what we report to them, but on what they observe of us and what they feel is important. Of primary interest to psychiatrists is aspects of our lives that they consider to be defective. They then sort these defects into categories and add them to their book, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or if you are in Europe, the ICD-10, or International Statistical Classification of Disease and Related Health Problems, which frankly sounds even worse. Now, both you and I know that the autistic community is on average quite anxious, pretty depressed, and overwhelmingly suffers from low self-esteem. There are a number of reasons for that, but I would say that having to spend our lives as autistic people allowed to interact with the rest of the world only on inferior terms and conceptualized as neurotypical people gone wrong is quite a big one. I don't need to say too much about that because you're here at an Autistic Pride event, and Joseph's just spoken about creating a positive view of autism. So you all know perfectly well what I'm talking about, and you know that we need to do away with that as an approach. But what do we replace it with? This is what we started to ask ourselves at the Autistic Empire. If we throw out all of the medical terminology, if we sidestep the critical disability model, if we started again from a viewpoint that centers the autistic experience and removes neurotypical people out of the equation entirely, what does that look like? What does it mean to be autistic? What do we have in common with each other across the spectrum? If you stop looking at problems and start looking at commonalities, what do we find? So we've spent the last 2 years looking at that and doing research, and we've come up with some interesting answers that I don't want to detail here because I only have a few minutes, but you can take a look on our website in your own time. But the big conclusion that we've come to when we stopped looking at problems and started looking at commonalities is this. The autistic community is far larger than any professional acknowledges. It's far bigger than those of us who are gathered here today. It's far bigger than those of us who have a diagnosis. It's far bigger than those of us who are trying to seek a diagnosis or identifies as autistic. In fact, from the work that we've done, I am coming to the opinion that the majority of autistic people do not know that they are autistic, and they certainly have no idea that we, the autistic community, exist. So it's therefore our responsibility as people who have the privilege, to identify as being autistic, to find out ways of reaching out to them and bringing them home. So as part of that, the question that I wanted to ask today is, who are we missing? What does it mean to build an autistic community that all of us can feel proud of? Who isn't here? Who should be part of our society and is not? These are very big questions, but given the global context in which we are celebrating today, I wanted to address one particular angle of that question, which is racism. I'm an occupational therapist and I work in a special school. I was at a conference last year to discuss research into autism, and one of the researchers had recently completed a demographic survey of the families of autistic children who were accessing services. She found that most, I don't want to say all, but a very significant number of service users were white and middle class, which makes sense, right? Only the most privileged in our society can make it through the government hoops that they put in our way in order to stop us having access to those services. But does that mean that Black autistic people and autistic people from other ethnic groups simply do not exist? Of course not. What this tells us is that non-white, non-middle class autistic people have so many barriers in their way that they aren't even getting started on the path of realising their autistic identity so they can realise the support in the community that we all need. At the same conference, a deputy head spoke from a school which had a At the same conference, a deputy head spoke at a school which had a satellite campus in Bangladesh. She was saying that the greatest barrier that they've had in communicating with the parents of the children that they work with is that their first language, Sylheti, doesn't have a word for autism. They have to say autism in English. There's just no conceptual framework to work with. Now, there's very little that most of us here can do today about the lack of knowledge of autism in communities that are not our own, but here is the question that we can answer. When someone does manage to cross those barriers and they find themselves in our autistic community, what are we going to be able to offer them? What does it mean to build an autistic community that all of us can feel proud of? Who isn't here? Who should be part of our society and is not? The recent protests around Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd has prompted some long overdue conversations around systemic racism and discrimination. But anti-racism is about more than knocking down slaver statues. Each of us has to look inside and say, what can I do to create an inclusive community and to dismantle exclusive structures? When we were first talking about what we wanted the empire to look like, it was not even a question to us that we would be anti-racist. We spent hours testing the skin tone of the hands in our corporate logo to make sure that they could be read as the widest possible range of ethnicities. The answer is there's an apricot skin tone that you can look up. We wrote into our branding policy that that colour could be changed to something culturally appropriate for any regional or Black and minority ethnic events, even though we've yet to hold one. We tried to organise panel discussions for Black History Month, and we've done everything we can in the content that we put out to make sure that this represents as diverse a range of people as possible so that people can see themselves in what we do. But we have very limited resources and we need the solidarity of others to make this work. In the 2 years that we've been in existence as an organisation, we have tried over and over again to reach out to Black groups, Black autistic people, and to talk to other autistic communities about Black issues. We have been hindered by a lack of infrastructure and a lack of understanding of autistic people, of Black narratives, and the specific needs of Black autistic people. We have had Black citizens represent the empire at events where they were made to feel uncomfortable as the only white person present. We've had Black people working with us victimised by microaggressions at autistic events. It has been very frustrating. We can't just wait for people to come to us and say what they need, because maybe, like Sylheti, they just don't have the words to tell us. Maybe the people who are not here don't know what we do. Maybe, as my friend and colleague Odai, who spoke at London Autistic Pride last year, maybe if they show up, they feel very uncomfortable about not seeing anyone else like them there. Is Odai really the only Black autistic person in all of London? What have we missed? We all have the privilege of knowing that we are autistic and of being able to turn out for a great event like Autistic Pride. And we have to use that privilege that we have to benefit others, to build our community, and to support each other as autistic people. So I want to ask everyone listening today, both today and on playback, what are you going to do in the next year to make Autistic Pride a time to be proud for every autistic person? Who are you going to tell? How are you going to tell them? And where are you going to tell them to go? Coronavirus has forced us online this year, which has given us a real opportunity to give access to these events to people who might not otherwise be able to attend a physical one. But if you're poor, you're so much less likely to have good internet access. If you live in a small town, as Joseph was saying earlier, you might not be able to travel into an event. Clearly, we need to have more events in more local areas. If you're relying on existing autistic organisations to spread the word, what about all of the autistic people who don't belong to them? What does it mean to build an autistic community that all of us can feel proud of? Who isn't here? Who should be part of our society and is not? and what are we going to do about it? Have a great Pride, everyone, and thank you very much for listening.